Chapter 2371. After a while, he lowered his head and flipped through them again. Then, he carefully said, "Look, none of them are funny. You want to see me smile?" His voice suddenly became hoarse. "You can beg me." Cher was about to explode. She glared at him and said, "Can you stop begging me all the time?" It was as if she wasn't satisfied. Strangely, he seemed to be able to read her mind. He chuckled and said, "I'm not satisfied yet. Do you want to do it again?" Cher didn't dare to look up and complained, "Pervert." He smiled and looked at her while she looked at the sketches. After a while, he suddenly said, "Actually, you remember, don't you?" She jerked her head up and stared at him, her eyes filled with shock. He didn't avoid her gaze and kept smiling. She said with difficulty, "How did you know?" "Because the way you look at me is different." He smiled and kissed her lips. "Welcome back, Sheen." He called her by her nickname, and Cher's eyes became watery. Her lips trembled, but she couldn't say a word. He had been looking at her with tolerance, as if they had been together since she was young. She was in his arms, and he was within reach. As long as she wanted to, she could have him again. Perhaps she was still angry with him before the car accident. Although she liked him, what happened 8 years ago was still a blow to her. But now, she didn't seem to care so much. What she cared about was his existence and whether he was still by her side. Schwer smiled and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Big brother," she called out. Their eyes met, and it was a reunion after a long time. At this moment of warmth, she suddenly asked, "Brother, didn't you want me to draw you?" Yimyun looked at her and gritted his teeth. "Tang Cher, do you think it's appropriate to do this now?" "Then what is appropriate?" She looked at him. Her appearance was pure and innocent, but there was an endless pair of eyes between her brows. She was like a little demoness in his embrace. He reached out and pinched her little chin. His gaze deepened as he said word by word, "Make love." She pouted. "You said I can't take it. Let's change it in another way." His voice was hoarse. He reached out and took the sketchbook in her hand to the side. Then he picked her up and walked to the bed. He kissed her and rubbed the tip of his nose against hers. "Taking care of you, huh?" She wrinkled her nose and said unhappily, "It's going to hurt." Yimyun chuckled. "Then I'll be gentler." In the end, he didn't let her go for the entire night. When it was over, she lay in his arms and said in a soft voice, "You are so unrestrained." His dark eyes were still staring at her, as if he hadn't eaten his fill. She lowered her head and bit angrily. He laughed, saying meaningfully, "It's because you've starved me for too long." Snow, however, suddenly thought of Song Karen. She harumphed. "Then you can do it with your previous girlfriend." "Previous girlfriend?" Yimyun chuckled. "But I don't want to." Because Song Karen wasn't the person in his heart. He didn't even want to force her. When he said that, she didn't know what to say and just looked at him. Chapter 2372. Yimyun raised his hand and turned off the light. He said with a sigh, "It's time to sleep." "Are you avoiding the question because I mentioned Song Karen?" She waved her fist and accidentally hit his chin in the dark. He frowned. "Do you think I need to avoid the question?" There was a smile in his voice again. "We're sleeping together again. It doesn't seem wise to care too much about other things, Mrs. Lon, huh?" His meaning made her unable to be confident anymore. She only dared to say in a small voice, "It's not true that we're married." Yimyun smiled and didn't say anything else. He just pressed her fluffy little head into his arms. It was late at night. The two hearts that had been lost for a long time finally reunited. "Brother, have you ever thought about me in the past 8 years?" she suddenly said. Yimyun lowered his head. He thought she was asleep, but he didn't expect her to still have the energy to talk. His voice was soft and hoarse. "Every day, every second, I think about you. Then why are you still looking for Song Karen to be your girlfriend?" Cher's little teeth bit hard on his chest. He felt a little pain, and then he smiled deeply. "I have to find a spare tire, don't I, Mrs. Lon? Don't you have one too?" Cher was angry. She scratched, bit, and hit him. "Try calling me Mrs. Lon again." She was so fierce that he restrained her with one hand. Her little body was pressed down, and no matter how much she struggled, it was useless. His black eyes were very close to her, and his voice was also low. "Then call me Mrs. Yeehaw." Cher's face turned red. Fortunately, The light was off, and he couldn't see it. Her little face was buried in his arms, and she didn't make a sound for a long time. He knew that she was shy. She was already 26 years old, almost 27 years old, and a mother of a child, but she was still so easily shy. The more she acted like this, the more he said shameless things in her ears. He couldn't see her face blushing, but he could feel her little heart beating fast, and her little face was frighteningly hot. Only then did he let her go. When he woke up in the morning, it was already a different morning. From now on, she would accompany him every day. Yi Muyun tilted his head, looked at his beloved girl, and kissed her. She didn't wake up. She probably had too much fun last night. She only frowned when he kissed her. He smiled, lifted the quilt, put on a robe, and went to check on Xiao Yishu. That little fellow had not woken up yet. When Mr. Yi returned from the nursery, he leaned against the bedside. His heart was full, but it was also a little lonely. The people he cared about the most were all by his side, but they were all sleeping. He went out to smoke a couple of cigarettes before returning to the bedroom. His little man was still asleep. He smiled and leaned against the side of the bed, reaching out to give her a hug. She had woken up. Lifting her delicate hand, she patted his handsome face lightly. "No!" He grabbed her little hand and said in a low and husky voice, "Don't you want to see Lanyu?" The little fellow in his arms immediately opened her eyes and looked up. "Really?" Mr. Ye's face instantly darkened. "Tang Share, if you show such a love-struck expression again, I guarantee that you will never see him in this lifetime." Her little mouth opened wide in an instant, and she looked at him eagerly. Then, as if she had thought of something, she acted coquettishly in his arms. "Brother." Chapter 2373. Xiao Yishu was still young, so there was no need to let her know for the time being. When they got into Yi Muyun's car together, Cher still asked uneasily, "What about the Lan family?" Yi Muyun fastened his seat belt slowly and looked at her. "Am I not supposed to be seen?" Cher was not confident. "You know." "Know what?" Yi Muyun said impatiently. "You know that Lanyu raised my daughter as his own and even raised her to be a boy, huh?" Cher lowered her head and put her hand on the car door. She said softly, "Then I won't go." Yi Muyun reached out and held her hand. After a long time, he said in a low voice, "Cher, I'm a little jealous, understand?" Her eyes widened as if she couldn't believe it. He raised his eyebrows slightly. "Is it strange that I'm jealous?" She was still looking at him with a surprised expression. Yi Muyun smiled and reached out to rub her hair. "Silly girl." After saying that, he started the car. Christmas was coming, and the winter in B City was very cold. Through the front window of the car, they could see snowflakes falling from the sky. "It's snowing." The person beside him said softly and then stretched out his hand. "So stupid." Yi Muyun drove very slowly. He looked at the silly girl beside him who was wearing a thick robe and couldn't help but smile. "Is it no snow in New York?" She turned her head and said softly with excitement on her face, "Brother, there's no you in New York." His eyes stayed on her face for a few more seconds, and then he focused on driving. Er's heart was boiling. Had she been too unreserved just now? Yi Muyun had been driving the whole time. When she calmed down, he suddenly said, "You're getting better at coaxing people now." "I'm not coaxing people." She fell for it and said quickly. Yi Muyun turned his head and looked at her with a smile. He didn't say anything else. When Cher came back to her senses, she realized that she had been fooled. But other than blushing, there was nothing she could do. The car was still running. She opened the window, and tiny snowflakes drifted into the car. Yi Muyun's voice was very calm. "You'll catch a cold. I want to feel it," she said softly, then turned her head and smiled sweetly at him. "Brother, are you happy?" Seeing her like this, his heart softened. How could he not be happy? He was so happy that he sent her to meet his ex-husband. However, the anger in his heart was not worth mentioning in front of her smile. So he held the steering wheel with one hand and grabbed her slender wrist with the other. Cher was stunned for a moment and turned to look at him. His hand slowly moved over to hold her little hand, intertwining their fingers. Her expression changed from astonishment to indescribable gaiety. She looked out of the window again and called him brother in a particularly excited voice. He did not let go of her hand. At this moment, Lanyu wasn't important anymore. She had already made her choice. The car stopped in the car park of the hospital. Cher was about to get out of the car when her hand was held. Then, his warm body covered hers, and without her noticing, he hugged her. His voice was deep. Cher, I'm sorry. And thank you. Sorry for his helplessness and giving up. Thank you for her understanding and returning to his side. Chapter 2374. Being hugged by him. Cher pursed her lips. After a long time, she said in a low voice, "It's okay." She said in a very low voice, "It's all in the past. Brother, it's all in the past." He didn't say anything, but just hugged her for a full 5 minutes. When he finally let go, he said in a low voice, "Don't leave my sight in the future." Bossy. Her voice was delicate and soft. It was killing him. Yimiyun looked at his watch and smiled. Okay, it's time to go up and see Lanyu. When they got out of the car together, he naturally held her little hand without any hesitation. Along the way, the staff of Xingyuan Hospital stared at him. Did Mr. Yi and little Princess Tang get back together again? When they reached the elevator, Cher struggled and said in a low voice, "It's better to keep a low profile." Are you afraid that Lanyu will be sad? He didn't let go of her little hand and held it very tightly. Cher had no choice but to look up at the top of the elevator. When the elevator door opened, she snorted. Bossy. Yi Miyun had endured all the criticism. Anyway, as long as it hurt Lanyu, it was all worth it. When they reached the door of the ward, the doctor happened to come out. When he saw Yi Miyun, he briefly explained Lanyu's condition. Lanyu's condition. Mr. Yi, it's not looking good. Cher was stunned for a moment and immediately asked, "What's wrong with him?" Yi Miyun patted her little hand to comfort her and then looked at the doctor. What happened? When Lanyu woke up yesterday, he saw that Lanyu still looked like he was about to recover. The doctor hesitated for a moment, probably thinking about what to say, and then said, Mr. Lan was also injured at that time. The nerves in his leg were compressed, and there was no treatment for it for a long time. So it's very likely that one of his legs will never be able to stand again. There was a trace of shock in Cher's eyes. If he couldn't stand again, did it mean that She didn't want to think about that possibility. But she was actually clear that that possibility was real. She pursed her lips and didn't say anything for a long time, but her little face was a little pale. Even Yi Muyun was a bit startled, but he quickly regained his senses and said indifferently, "You guys form a group of experts. If that doesn't work, then invite expert from abroad to come and treat Mr. Lanyu's leg." The doctor was a little surprised. Wasn't Lanyu and their Mr. Yi the rival in love? If Lanyu's leg was disabled, how could he compete with Mr. Yi? So, how could he compete with Mr. Yi? Therefore, a successful man with this state of mind, this mindset, this heart was all big. The doctor nodded and smiled. Yes, I understand, Chairman Yi. Yi Muyin gestured for him to leave first before turning to look at Xuan. Are you satisfied now? Cher lowered her head. What if it can't be cured? He reached out and caressed her long hair, his voice hoarse. You have to believe that Lanyu relies on his talent and not his looks. Just his talent alone has countless women throwing themselves at him. Cher widened her eyes and turned her head away, ignoring him. She walked to the door of the ward and stood there for a long time before she plucked up the courage to push the door open. The moment she pushed it open, a plate flew towards her, accompanied by an angry shout from Lanyu, "Scram!" Chapter 2375. Cher froze on the spot and forgot to dodge. If Yi Muyun hadn't pulled her away, she would have been hit on the forehead. When she calmed down, she saw Lanyu sitting on the hospital bed and throwing a tantrum at the nurses. Get out of my way. I won't be discharged. The two nurses' eyes were watery as they comforted him. Mr. Lan, this is only temporary. Our attending doctor will find a way to treat him. Are you trying to feed me chicken soup? Lanyu narrowed his eyes and looked at the nurses. I'll say it for the last time. Get out. The two nurses' eyes were filled with tears. They rolled back and forth, but didn't fall. Cher watched from the door. She couldn't believe that the person in front of her was Lanyu. In the past, Lanyu was gentle and reserved. He almost never lost his temper and had always been gentle. However, the man in front of her was full of hostility and irritation like a wild beast. Coupled with his untrimmed hair, He looked like a raging lion. She looked at him quietly. Lanya looked up and saw her. His angry gaze slowly darkened. He just stared at her like that, as calm as the sea and as unfathomable as it was. Snow's lips moved slightly, and she called out, "Lanyu." Lanyu was still looking at her. After a long time, he laughed at himself. "Why did you come to see me? Shouldn't I?" Cher's voice was very soft. She turned back to look at Yi Mu-yun and asked with difficulty, "Can I talk to him alone for a while?" Yi Mu-yun looked at her calmly and nodded. Of course. The two nurses were stunned. They reminded her instinctively, "Miss Tang, Mr. Lanyu is emotionally unstable right now. We are afraid that." Lanyu's eyes were bloodshot. He glared at the two nurses. "Will I eat her up?" The two nurses didn't dare to say a word. Then they ran out in despair. Cher walked past them and closed the door quietly. When she closed the door, she saw the look on Yi Mu-yun's face. There was no one else like that expression on his face. She mouthed petty. He naturally knew what she was talking about and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This little bastard. She wanted to be alone with a man, so why couldn't he be jealous? He closed the door and shook his head. He leaned against the door and looked at the young nurse. "Why aren't you leaving?" The two nurses looked at Mr. Yi and sighed in their hearts. Mr. Yi's heart was really big. However, they didn't dare to stay and just left. Yi Mu-yun looked at their backs and leisurely took out a cigarette from his pocket. He calmly lit it, his eyes a little deep. In the ward, Cher pursed her lips and slowly approached Lanyu. Lanyu glared at her. His expression wasn't friendly. He snorted coldly. "Are you here to see me because you pity me?" Cher finally came to his side. She lowered her eyes and her lips trembled slightly. However, she didn't say a word. Lanyu suddenly pushed her away and threw something at the door. With a loud thud, it landed on the door and slid to the ground, letting out an ear-piercing, shattering sound. Yi Mu-yun was smoking outside the door. Naturally, he heard the shattering sound. His body froze for a moment before he continued smoking as though he didn't hear it. Inside the room, Cher bit her lips. She was shocked. Chapter 2376. What else can I do? Lanyu sneered. What else do you think a cripple like me can do? He smiled mockingly. Or do you think I can get that nurse into my bed? Cher frowned and said, "You're not that kind of person. You're not allowed to talk about yourself like that." Lanyu chuckled. "You think too highly of me, Miss Tang." He paused and looked at her with a gloomy gaze. He said word by word, "That's the kind of person I am. Can't you tell?" Cher recalled Yi Mu-yun's words and coughed. "You're talented." Lanyu looked at her. His gaze was so dark that she couldn't help but tremble at the sight of it. He said, "Tang Cher, do you know me? Do you know my past? Do you know how many women I've used and slept with on my way to success?" "Huh?" He narrowed his eyes and sneered. "I even like my own sister. I'm a complete pervert." "No, you're not," Cher said anxiously. "You're not." She squatted down, grabbed one of his hands, and placed it on her chest. She looked up at him seriously, looking at the man she had lived with for years. This man had saved her before. Even though she knew it was all a conspiracy, she couldn't hate him, because she knew that he would be in more pain than she was after all of this. "You're not. Lanyu, you have the ability to love." She looked at him with gentleness in her eyes. "You love me, don't you? You're not as cold-hearted as you think you are, and you're not as dark as you think you are. You can walk out of it, just like how it was back then." "Huh?" Lanyu lowered his eyes and looked at her little face. There was no expression on his face. She couldn't tell what he was thinking at that moment. He looked at her like this for a long time, and suddenly smiled darkly. At this time, Lanyu's hair was a little messy. His beard had grown long, and he hadn't shaved for a long time. His cheeks were sunken because of his thinness. He looked very different from before, especially when he smiled like this. He looked especially cold. Cher was a little uneasy, but she didn't run away. Instead, she held his hand tightly. Lanyu leaned forward. His gloomy face was close to hers, and his voice was gloomy and hoarse. "Well, you want to save me, don't you?" He leaned close to her little face and smiled a little strangely. "Leave him and be with me, hmm?" Snow's lips quivered as she stared at him helplessly. Lanyu chuckled and said mockingly, "Since you've chosen to be with him, Why do you still care about what I do? Scram, as far as you can. As he shouted, the veins on Lan Yu's forehead bulged. He looked extremely shocked. He pushed her away, and his face was back to its previous ruthlessness. Cher fell to the side and looked at him with pursed lips. There was a look of disbelief on her face. Lan Yu's body leaned toward her. One of his legs wasn't nimble, so he leaned toward her. However, he lost his balance and flipped off the bed. Falling on top of her, Cher screamed and instinctively supported Lan Yu, not letting his leg fall on her. Chapter 2377. Her face was being squeezed and it hurt. She felt as though the thin layer of skin was about to deform. She gritted her teeth and said in a low voice, Lan Yu, can you be rational? He was still smiling strangely. You said that my wife ran away with me, and I still have to be rational. Cher gritted her teeth. Lan Yu, it's impossible between us. If it's impossible, then scram. Don't be a saint, he said viciously before propping himself up with one leg, trying his best to climb back onto the bed. However, he was simply too weak and fell back down the moment he lifted his body. This time around, he fell heavily at the side. Cher wanted to help him up, but her hand was grabbed by him, and he threw her aside heavily. He looked at her and laughed coldly. See that? I don't even have the strength to climb back onto the bed. Tang Cher, why are you still pestering me? Are you here to watch me make a fool of myself? Cher knelt at the side and bit her lip. Her face was full of vulnerability, but the words that came out of her mouth were infuriating. That's right. I'm here to watch you make a fool of yourself. Not only today, but tomorrow and the day after. I'll be here every day from now on to watch you make a fool of yourself. Lan Yu's face was turning green with anger. He glared at her and roared, Scram. Fine. Cher pursed her lips. Also, I won't call the nurse for you. Just sit on the floor. His face was now dark as he glared at her. Tang Cher, help me to the bed now. Cher took a step back and laughed lightly. I'm here to watch you make a fool of yourself. Why should I help you to the bed? If you want to go up, you can climb up yourself. You still have one leg, don't you? Lan Yu's face was dark as he glared at her. If looks could kill, Lan Yu would have already done so. At this moment, the door opened. It wasn't Yi Muyun who opened the door, but Lan Yu's parents. As soon as the door was opened, the situation in the ward shocked everyone, especially Lan Yu's parents, who were distressed. He rushed in and glared at Cher angrily. He's already in such a state, and you're still treating him like this. Are you even human? Blue Mother, in particular, wants to fan in the past with a slap. Her hand is caught by Yi Muyun. His voice is very heavy. Mrs. Lan, this is not your wild place. Mrs. Lan gritted her teeth and looked up at Yi Muyun. Chairman Yi, I know you're very powerful in B-City and can cover the sky with one hand, but my son became like this in order to save this woman. Can't I even hit him? Yi Muyun's gaze was as deep as water. Mrs. Lan, have you forgotten who hit Cher? Your daughter committed a crime, so your son has to pay the price. Isn't that fair? In one sentence, he touched Mrs. Lan's pain point. Mrs. Lan's voice was sharp and harsh. What about my Ting Ting? In New York, she jumped off a building for you. Don't you feel it all? Shui Er was stunned for a moment, but Yi Muyun gently pulled her into his embrace. He looked at Mrs. Lan, smiled softly, and pursed his thin lips. Mrs. Lan, do I have to be responsible if she likes me? What does it have to do with me? Besides, is she dead? Mrs. Lan's face was pale, and she couldn't say a word. Yi Muyun continued to sneer. Her final death is because of Lan Yu's twisted love, indulgence of her, and your indulgence of her. Yi Muyun paused for a moment and continued, Don't put your own pot on others. Chapter 2378. Mrs. Lan was so angry that her whole body was shaking. She pointed at Yi Muyun and said, Get out of here. Don't come here again. She kept saying, Lan Yu, let's transfer to another hospital. Okay? We don't live here anymore. Yes, they want to murder you, just like they did to Ting Ting. Blue Mother said, kneeling on the ground. She didn't even know what she said. She just kept saying, they want to kill you, they want to hurt you, Lan Yu. Have you forgotten Ting Ting? Don't you like Ting Ting best? She muttered to herself many times, and Lan Yu closed his eyes slightly. Cher was also stunned. The Lan family knew that Lan Yu liked Lan Ting. Then when she returned to Bee City, what was the meaning of their kindness? She was a fool. She bit her lip, and her face was a little pale. Yi Muyun reached out and pressed her in his arms so that she wouldn't hear it. She didn't need to know these dark things. At this time, Lan Yu used up his last strength. Enough! Blue Mother was stunned. She couldn't believe that this was what her son said. Her son helped others to talk about her. Her voice was a little sad. Lan Yu, Ting Ting is dead. She is dead. Wake up, okay? Lan Yu stared at her, his face tense, his entire person exuding a frightening aura. He gritted his teeth and said coldly, "Yes, she's dead. But Mom, I'm not the only one who had such a ridiculous dream all these years." It was their family's abnormal love that brought Lan Ting to the current situation. After Lan Yu finished speaking, Mo's mother's face turned pale. She didn't want to accept such a fact. At the beginning, they knew that Lan Yu liked Lan Ting and had always doted on Lan Ting. After Lan Ting jumped off a building, the doctor found that she was mentally ill. Lan Yu was determined to send her to treatment. But how could Lan Yu's mother be willing to send her to treatment? Did sending her to treatment mean admitting that the Lan family had a neurosis? This was something she absolutely could not accept. After that, Lan Ting led a befuddled life. Lan Yu also ran off to learn painting. This family was once thought to be hopeless. However, Lan Yu brought back the beautiful Tang Cher and Xiao Yishu. The old couple had always thought that God was kind to the Lan family, and they finally had descendants. It turned out that everything was an ill-fated relationship. Lan Yu, are you worthy of your sister? Mrs. Lan burst into tears. You saved this woman and gave up your sister. Cher's body nestled in Yi Muyun's arms, gently trembling. Although she already knew all of this, she was still hurt when she was openly torn apart by others. She lay in Yi Muyun's arms, trembling like an injured little beast. As for Lan Yu, he was lying on the ground, looking ugly and pathetic. His eyes were fixed on her. Seeing how clean she was and himself, Lan Yu smiled softly, and his smile was a little sad. He didn't even know when he had fallen in love with her. If it wasn't for the car accident, he would probably never admit it to himself. Cher's gaze met Lan Yu's. He was so pathetic, and the pain in his eyes was so clear. The softest part of her heart felt like it had been hit. During those 5 years, when she was on the verge of death, Lan Yu had reached out and carried Yishu. Those ordinary days, his gentle care, it was like a net that covered her, making it hard for her to breathe. Chapter 2379. She took a few steps forward and knelt down, supporting Lan Yu's arm and shoulder with one hand. He was thin to begin with, and now that he was sick, he was even lighter. Although she was weak, she could actually support him. Lan Yu was stunned. Looking at her face that was inches away from him, his throat tightened. Tang Cher, what are you doing? I'm saving a jerk. Cher gritted her teeth and glared at him. Lan Yu narrowed his eyes. Do you think you're savior? Scram back to Yi Muyun's side. Of course I have to scram back, but before that, I want to see how you're going to suffer a fate worse than death to reattach your broken leg. Cher scoffed. Lan Yu almost exploded. His messy hair was all standing up, and his thin face was filled with shock. He continued to stare at Snow, his voice hoarse as he said, Do you want to see how miserable I am? Yes. Cher's voice was relaxed. You can think of it as a woman's heart. Lan Yu looked up and looked at Yi Muyun, saying almost pathetically, Take your woman away. Mr. Yi stood there elegantly. His handsome appearance was worlds apart from Lan Yu. Lan Yu pursed his lips and looked at the man in front of him, suddenly feeling a little dazzled. Those dark thoughts blotted out the sky and covered the earth, pressuring him to the point he was almost unable to breathe. Only when he sobered up did he understand that it was jealousy. Yes, he was jealous that Yi Muyun could get all of her love and innocence. It would be a lie to say that he didn't regret it. If he had been ruthless that day, he would have gotten her. However, he was also glad that he didn't force himself on her. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to stand in front of her now. Yi Muyun chuckled. Usually, I won't object to what she wants to do. Lan Yu was stunned. Then, Yi Miyun raised his hand, and several security guards appeared at the door. Take Mr. and Mrs. Lan away. In the future, no one is allowed to enter this VIP ward without my approval. Yi Miyun's voice was especially indifferent. Whatever she wants to do, even if it's nonsense, I will fulfill her wish. Lan Yu was completely stunned. Cher was also stunned. She slowly turned her head and looked at Yi Miyun. He was just pretending. When did he become so generous? It was simply to anger Lan Yu. However, she needed his help. No matter how angry she was, she didn't say anything. Mrs. Lan was carried out by the security guards like a chicken. She screamed, "Let me go, you bastards. I am Lan Yu's mother. Why can't I see my son? I will call the police and arrest you lawless people." The doctor was at the side, expressionless. Because Mr. Lan is not in a good state now, it's not appropriate to visit. Mrs. Lan screamed, "You bastards, I'm going to sue you. You're trying to murder my son. Go ahead." The doctor smiled slightly and made a gesture of go ahead to her, and then said softly, "The police will come here for at least half an hour, and this half an hour is enough for us to do a lot of things. For example, a needle can make people completely insane. Of course, the police will let you take Mr. Lan Yu back, but we can't guarantee that he's still a good patient." Blue Mother's face changed again and again, and finally it was completely black. She broke her mouth and scolded, "You quack." Chapter 2380. Mother Lan's eyes went black, and she fainted as soon as she rolled her eyes. Yi Miyun looked at Lan Yu, stepped forward, and supported Lan Yu to the hospital bed. Then he looked at Cher and said, "Go back first. If you want to come, you can come every day." Then he looked at Lan Yu and said lightly, "It's up to you whether you want to be depressed or be the original you. However, Cher is obsessed with appearance. She probably won't like your current appearance." After he finished speaking, Lan Yu looked up at him and met the cold and noble Yi Miyun's gaze. For a moment, no one spoke. Cher looked at this and that, but she didn't dare to say anything. Finally, Yi Miyun grabbed her little hand and said, "Let's go home first." "Oh," she said. After taking 2 steps, she couldn't help but look back at Lan Yu. Yi Miyun didn't turn around. He just said softly, "Lan Yu, I'll give you a chance to compete fairly." After a pause, he chuckled and said, "The premise is that you take care of yourself." Lan Yu was so angry that his face was dark. Cher turned around and said in a low voice, "When did you become so annoying?" Mr. Yi said proudly, "I've been generous enough." Her little hand secretly pulled his palm and asked carefully, "Can I really choose again?" Yi Miyun snorted and said, "What do you think?" Anyway, he didn't have anything to worry about with Lan Yu's appearance. Cher said cautiously, "What if you recover?" Yi Miyun stopped and looked at her coldly. "You said I could choose again." She bit her lip, but there was a touch of mischief in her eyes. Yi Miyun looked at her eyes and felt angry and funny. He reached out and rubbed her hair and snorted, "Idiot. If you call me an idiot one more time, I'll be with Lan Yu." Cher pursed her lips and threatened softly. Mr. Yi looked at Lan Yu and smiled faintly. "All right, you can go now." With Lan Yu's current state, she probably couldn't bring herself to do it. As he spoke, the little man hung on his arm, refusing to come down, and went out. Lan Yu was left lying there. He knew that he had already lost. It was not because of his looks or his legs, but because there had never been a place for anyone else between Yi Miyun and Tang Cher. He propped himself up, looked at the button beside the bed, and pressed it. 5 minutes later, the doctor came in and smiled. "Mr. Lan, it seems that you've thought it through and want to receive treatment, right?" Lan Yu's eyes were gloomy, and he did not speak. Sigh. If I were Mr. Lan, with such a reputation and so many properties of the Lan family, I would try my best to stand up, wouldn't I? The doctor's smile was not like that of a doctor. He held a book in his hand and said faintly, "From today onwards, we'll start with a recovery injection. However, it might be a little painful." Lan Yu looked up at the doctor. He was a male doctor, but his face was unbelievably pale, and he looked like a gigolo. So effeminate. Lan Yu looked down on such a doctor from the bottom of his heart. So he said with a sullen face, "I want to change doctors." "Change doctors? I'm sorry, but I have the final say in Xinyuan Hospital. The doctor smiled meaningfully. I forgot to tell you, my surname is Qin. I'm Mr. Ye's younger brother. Lan Yu's face darkened. Qin Mo? Impossible. Chapter 2381. The doctor leaned forward so that his face was very close to Lan Yu's. He said word by word, "My name is Qin Shun. I'm Yi Muyun's youngest brother." Lan Yu squinted his eyes. Only then did he remember that Qin Mu did have a twin brother named Qin Shun. He didn't expect that the Qin family could raise a boy like this. He looked especially feminine. Qin Shun's face was still very close to his, so close that Lan Yu could see his overly beautiful eyelashes. They were long and curly. He didn't look like a man at all. At this moment, he had an illusion that this man was flirting with him. For Lan Yu, this was a great humiliation. His Adam's apple moved a little, and he said coldly, "You're not a homosexual, are you?" "Mr. Lan, you're thinking too much. Even if I were, Mr. Lan's looks are not within my consideration. So, please cooperate with the treatment, Mr. Lan. As for other improper thoughts, don't even think about it." Qin Shin smiled a little abominably. Lan Yu's face darkened. Shameless doctor. His eyes were obviously full of picky beans. Lan Yu's face was full of rejection. Qin Shun straightened his body and chuckled. "Mr. Lan, as long as you're obedient and cooperate with our experiment." "No, it's the treatment. I promise that it won't be particularly painful. I'll be gentle and gentle." Lan Yu gritted his teeth. "You quack." Qin Shin smiled. "If you can walk out of this ward now, the experiment on you will stop. But unfortunately, you can't even jump out." Lan Yu squinted and glared at him fiercely. "What do you want to do to me?" Qin Shin stood in front of the bed. His expression had the unique coldness of a doctor, but his face was very beautiful. Especially when the corners of his mouth curled up, there was a touch of naughtiness. Qin Shin smiled faintly. "The nerves in your legs are necrotic. So far, there hasn't been a single case that has been cured, so we can't guarantee the effect. However, the worst-case scenario is the same as now." Lan Yu's face was gloomy as he looked at the outrageously beautiful male doctor. "Is this how you comfort your patients? Do they complain about you?" Qin Shin smiled and lowered his body. "Mr. Lan's leg is broken, but his brain is fine, right? I'm threatening you, not comforting you, okay?" Lan Yu lay down and covered his head with the blanket. "Get out." However, the handsome doctor did not leave. Instead, he placed his hands in his white coat and said softly, "You need an injection. It might be a little painful. So, in order to prevent Mr. Lan from hurting himself, we have to tie you up first." Lan Yu abruptly lifted the quilt. He couldn't bear it anymore. "I'm not your test subject." He was wrong. This was not a quack at all. This was a black-hearted doctor. He struggled, but his legs were inconvenient, and he was weak. 2 strong nurses were enough to subdue him. Lan Yu was pinned down. He was embarrassed and embarrassed. He had never been like this before. He was fooled by a doctor who was neither a man nor a woman. He must be a spy sent by Yi Muyun. The tall and strong nurse pinned him down, but it was also quite strenuous. Qin Shun walked over slowly with a thick needle in his hand. It was the kind that was used to give injections to pigs. Even Lan Yu was in a daze. He stared at him and panted heavily. "Let me go." "Treatment." Qin Shun smiled faintly. "Don't worry. It's just a little pain. I won't die." He looked at the nurse beside him. "Roll up your trousers." Chapter 2382. The nurse stepped forward, lifted the quilt aside, and then rolled up his trousers. However, the hospital gown was too long, and she couldn't roll it up. The nurse looked at Qin Shun with some hesitation. "Dr. Qin, I can't roll it up." Qin Shun glanced at it and said in a very indifferent tone, "Then pull it down from the top." The nurse hesitated. Pull it down from the top, and it became one word. Wasn't it just to take it off? This wasn't very good. After all, Lan Yu was also a public figure. The nurse hesitated, and Qin Shun glared at them, and personally went to pull it up. His action was very rough, and with a swoosh, the nurse covered her eyes together. Oh, Dr. Qin, the coolest Dr. Qin in the hospital, did such an indescribable thing to Lan Yu. At that moment, Lan Yu's expression was also very interesting. After finishing, Qin Shun directly pointed the needle at Lan Yu's knee. and his face was actually frightened and pale. Qin smiled. Are you afraid of needles? Lan Yu would never admit it, and his face was cold. No, it's good that you don't, because this needle is really painful. Dr. Qin coughed lightly, and Lan Yu, he was sure that he didn't hear it wrong. This black-hearted doctor's tone was with a touch of gloating. Goddamn, he struggled, but his broken body and the hospital gown that was pulled down to his knees made him look extremely embarrassed. At this time, he even had the heart to kill him. When the thick needle pierced his skin, Lan Yu's forehead was full of beads of sweat, and his voice was also gritting his teeth. I swear, as long as I can, I will definitely kill you with my own hands. Qin focused on pushing the needle and found time to smile, revealing his hateful white teeth. Wait until you can walk. They were very close, so close that Lan Yu could smell the faint cologne on his body. A sissy doctor wearing perfume. Lan Yu glared at him, his eyeballs almost popping out of their sockets. But the pain continued. That piercing pain in his heart made him unable to say a single word. He panted heavily, his arm tightly pinched into Qin arm, so deep that blood almost came out. However, Qin only frowned slightly. His voice was a little hoarse. Mr. Lan, aren't you not afraid of death? Now you're acting like a woman. Lan Yu's eyeballs bulged. His appearance was completely different from his usual appearance. The nurse couldn't bear to watch. With Dr. Qin here, the patient might die from anger. However, look at how professional Dr. Qin is. His hand is pinched like this, but the needle is still stable. It should be known that this kind of needle that stimulates the nerves, if it deviates, there's no hope for Lan Yu's leg in this life, and it is very likely that his upper body will be paralyzed. The young nurses all looked at Qin with admiration. Dr. Qin is the light of holy far away, a figure that even the director of the hospital is afraid of. At this time, their Dr. Qin pushed all the medicine in and slowly pulled out the needle. When the needle was pulled out, Lan Yu let out another roar. Qin straightened his body, slapped his hand away, and sneered. Look at you screaming like a virgin. No one wants to force themselves on you. Lan Yu panted and fell on the pillow. He didn't care about his embarrassment, and while panting, he shouted, I want to complain about you. Go ahead. Qin didn't care. Only his eyes flashed with a hint of evil, and then he took off his mask. Just as Lan Yu thought, he was unbelievably beautiful, the kind that was even more beautiful than a girl. Moreover, he was very similar to Qin Mu, but with a bit more heroic. Chapter 2383. Lan Yu glared at him angrily. He felt that he couldn't do anything to this quack doctor. Qin looked at the nurse and said, Pull up his pants. Lan Yu was so ashamed that he wanted to die. Qin must have been sent by Yi Muyun to torture him. Lan Yu lay on the bed and refused to talk. Qin threw the syringe aside and wiped his hands with a tissue. He said calmly, Mr. Lan Yu's brain may have some problems. Contact the neurosurgery department. Lan Yu turned his head and gritted his teeth. Qin, don't go too far. So you're not stupid. That's great. Qin's voice was cold. He looked at Lan Yu condescendingly. All right, you can have a good rest. Try not to move that leg. I'll come back tomorrow to give you an injection. Lan Yu said coldly, I don't want to treat it anymore. If you don't want to, how can you chase after a girl in a wheelchair? Qin smiled coldly. Don't be ridiculous. After that, he walked out. His back was handsome and cool. At the very least, the young nurses covered their faces as they watched. They cried out in excitement. Lan Yu pursed his lips and glanced at the two nurses. He said coldly, You like this, sissy? The nurses covered their faces. Sissy? Our Dr. Qin is definitely not a sissy. The nurses said in unison, You'll know in the future. In the future? Lan Yu sneered. He was sure now. However, his sneer made the nurses dislike him. He was not handsome at all. He was weird. They should go see Dr. Qin. At least he was pleasing to the eye. The nurses helped Lan Yu tidy up his clothes and left. Qin was outside. He held a notebook in one hand and a pen in the other. He looked at them and asked, Are you angry? The young nurse laughed. With Dr. Qin around, even if he doesn't die from the treatment, he'll probably die from anger. Qin Shin got up and smiled faintly. Don't worry. Lan Yu is like a cockroach that can't be killed. His heart for Tang Sher hasn't died yet. How can he be willing to die? After saying that, he shrugged and walked towards his office. The two nurses looked at each other, and one of them asked carefully, "Do you think Dr. Qin did on purpose? Where's the thick syringe?" Pooh, pooh, pooh. Dr. Qin is the most upright doctor in our hospital. Why would he do such a thing? But it's not impossible. The two young nurses smiled at each other. Inside the door, Lan Yu was lying quietly, his whole body burning with combat power. He had to stand up and kill Dr. Blackheart with his own hands. Moreover, he really didn't give up. In the parking lot downstairs of Shengyuan, Yi Muyun held the phone in his hand. After quietly listening to Qin Shen's call, he tilted his head and looked at Cher, who looked worried. Qin Shen settled it. Shui Er grunted in acknowledgement, then asked him, "Did Qin Shen just come back to the country?" "Yes, less than a month." Yi Muyun rubbed her hair. "Do you want to meet him?" As he said that, he started the car. Cher said hesitantly, "Haven't we already met? I don't think we have a private meeting." Yi Muyun smiled and held his chin with his fingers. He asked while driving, "By the way, we should discuss the wedding date." He paused for a moment. "It seems to be 8 years late, Miss Tang." Chapter 2384. Shui Er's face reddened, and she snorted. "I wonder who caused it. It's my fault for getting you pregnant." He smiled and suddenly said, "Oh yeah, back then, did you get pregnant on purpose, huh?" "I didn't." Her voice was tender and soft, not convincing at all. And so he knew. He didn't laugh at her, but his heart ached for her. His handsome face restrained his expression. Other than gentleness, there was also a tinge of heartache. He held her hand and didn't let go. Cher said in a low voice, "I'm sorry, I didn't protect Ishu well." She thought that the child was gone, but she didn't expect that the child would be born in another way. Both of them were at peace. After a long time, she looked at him sideways. "Actually, it's not just because of me. You're also very grateful to Lan Yu, right?" Mr. Ye's expression darkened, and he snorted. "Really?" He didn't want to admit it. She naturally knew the reason, so she smiled faintly and didn't say much. Yi Muyun clenched his fists and said in a deep voice, "I won't let you go alone in the future." He didn't dare to think about everything that had happened to her in New York and how much pain she had been in. "I don't blame you." She tilted her head and smiled sweetly. Her smile was like a ray of sunlight that illuminated his entire life. His throat rolled for a long time before he said hoarsely, "Okay." Cher smiled faintly too, tilting her head and watching him drive. The sunlight shone into the car, and her face was so fair and clean that even the little hairs on her face could be seen clearly. At a red light, he stopped the car and looked at her sideways, smiling faintly. "Yes, I'm quite grateful to him." So, when he wanted to kill Lan Yu countless times, he thought about how Ishu and Cher were fine while Lan Yu had become like that. He couldn't help but feel his heart soften. She was right. It wasn't just because she was unwilling, but because Lan Yu had really saved her and Xiao Ishu. The debts between men were usually settled clearly. From the beginning to the end, it had always been a scheme between Lan Yu and him, Yi Muyun. Zhou Chengwang was just an accident caught in the middle, or a chess piece used by Lan Yu. Of course, he also knew the principle of letting the tiger return to the mountain, and there would be no end of trouble in the future. However, he was still willing to do it. He would feel at ease, and Cher would be happy. Xiao Ishu would also be happy. What he wanted the most right now was to make them happy. The car slowly drove back to the villa. The little person was sitting in the courtyard waiting. His chubby little hand supported his chin. He looked extremely cute. The car stopped. As soon as Imuyun got out of the car, he saw the chubby little guy running back. It was obvious that they were throwing a tantrum. Cher looked at him and was a little stunned. She's probably unhappy that she didn't bring Lan Yu along because she knew that he had woken up. Yi Muyun's head hurt a little as he looked at Cher. "You used to let Lan Yu take care of her?" Cher's neck drooped, and she cleverly kept quiet. Yi Muyun looked at her and said nothing more. He knew that he couldn't count on her too much. He walked into the living room slowly. Xiao Ishu was sprawled on the sofa, as though she was reading a comic. However, Yi Muyun knew that she was pretending because the comic was placed upside down. Chapter 2385. Xiao Ishu looked at him in disbelief. Her eyes widened. You will let me see, Dad? Cher happened to walk in at this time. She was a little worried when she heard Xiao Ishu's words, because she knew that Yi Muyun actually longed for Ishu to call him Dad. She pursed her lips and was about to speak, but he had already held the little fellow in his arms. His voice was very light. Of course, he's your father, isn't he? Why wouldn't I let Ishu see her father? This time, not only the little fellow was surprised, but even Cher was a little surprised. When did his realm become so high? Yi Muyun's heart sank a little. If these years were indelible to Cher, then he could only accept it. His voice became even gentler as he coaxed the little fellow in his arms. But Lan Yu is Dad, and Uncle is also Dad, right? The little fellow lowered her little face. She couldn't say it all. Perhaps she was also feeling very uneasy. She looked up at Yi Muyun with tears in her eyes and called out softly, Yi Sanson. Yi Muyun forced a smile. He was a little disappointed, but he still reached out to rub her hair. In a few days, let Mom take you to see him, man. Xiao Ishu stared at him in a silly but adorable manner. Her voice became even softer. Really? Of course it's true. Well, has Uncle ever lied to you? Yi Muyun kissed her and held the little fellow in his arms. Perhaps it was a conditional exchange, so the little fellow didn't struggle and obediently stayed in his arms. Shue looked at him and smiled faintly. She always felt that he was different and had become gentler. In the past, the way he handled things was often extreme, but now was different. He had become especially gentle and humane. She thought that she liked him, and everything he did was for her and Ishu. She looked at him with a trace of infatuation in her eyes. Whether she was 8 years old, 18 years old, or now 26 years old, the one she loved was him. Her eyes shone with the light of the sun, filled with her love for him. Yi Muyun happened to look up at her eyes and smiled lightly. Xiao Ishu watched them flirt with each other, and her little body fell to the side. One great Qing, and one great death. His mother and Yi Sanson were completely together. Although she was Yi Sanson's daughter, in her heart, Lan Yu's papa was more important. Xiao Ishu secretly thought that Lan Yu's papa and mama would be together. Although this would make Yi Sanson sad, children were born not to like change, especially when Yi Sanson forced her to wear a small skirt. She didn't like to wear a small skirt. The little fellow collapsed on the sofa, looking exactly the same as Cher when she was young. Yi Muyun directly looked at the child's mother. The meaning in his eyes was, I'm giving you a look. Feel it yourself. Cher also felt a little guilty, because this gene was passed down from her. She walked over and tugged at his sleeve. Her voice became even softer. It's not a girl, it doesn't matter. His eyes were a little clear. Then are you willing to have another son? His little girl lowered her eyes and said in a voice like a mosquito, I have to be able to give birth. Her body was no longer able to get pregnant. She knew that. She didn't dare to tell him. Chapter 2386. After saying that, she looked at him nervously, for fear that he would dislike it. She knew that he hoped to have a boy so that he could inherit the Boyi family. Besides, no one had the heart to force little Ishu to do something like this. Yi Muyun smiled. If you can't have a boy, you can urge Zhao Yin to get married. I think his son will inherit the Tang family. No one will object. Cher raised her hand and asked, Do you think his son will be willing if Zhao Yin doesn't want it? Yi Muyun's face darkened. In the end, he was the only idiot who fought for power. What he did all these years was stupid. Cher knew that his face darkened, so she tried her best to please him and praise him. Brother is the best. What about in bed? He looked at her and asked blatantly. He did not hide it from the child. Cher lowered her head and bit her lips. You're also good. Little Ishu looked at this and then at that, and then burst into tears. It was so hateful. Yi Muyun sneered in his heart. He could call Lan Yu daddy, but he had to know who the seed provider was. Cher glared at him. Shameless. Mr. Yi said innocently, Didn't you make her cry? However, he soon laughed and picked up Xiao Ishu and kissed her. Okay, don't cry. I want to sleep with Mommy. Cher was speechless. Xiao Yishu was such a naive little creature. She was coaxed immediately and blinked her tears. You really won't sleep with me? Then the little girl completely forgot that she was a little boy. She blinked her tears. Then Xiao Yishu will sleep with mommy from now on. Of course. Yimuyun pinched her little nose and smiled. Uncle can satisfy all of Xiao Yishu's questions. The little girl looked at him suspiciously, her expression adorable. Snow, on the other hand, rolled her eyes. She could believe in anything else, but this was something she would rather die than believe. Was it possible for a person who was used to eating meat to suddenly become a vegetarian? She pursed her lips and stole a glance at him. As expected, he winked at her. Cher, she knew it. At night, Xiao Yishu was very vigilant and kept pestering her mother, not giving Yi Sanson a chance to take advantage of her. However, Yimuyun did not show up. He left the little doll in her care while he dealt with official business in his study. He hadn't returned to the company for a long time and usually dealt with things at home. When he was done, he looked at his watch. It was already 10 o'clock at night. It was the time when children were asleep. He smiled and got up to close his laptop. Under the warm yellow light, he walked back to Cher's bedroom. He slowly approached the bed and saw the little doll sleeping soundly. Her little hands were holding her mother's body. It looked infinitely beautiful. Yimuyun reached out and unbuttoned the top 2 buttons of his shirt. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her quietly for a long time. The bedroom was quiet and filled with a sweet smell. Of course, there was also the smell of the little yellow bun. His heart softened. He couldn't help but lean over and kiss Xiao Yishu's little face. Then, he took a deep breath of the smell of the yellow bun. God knew how happy he was that Xiao Yishu was a girl, a replica of Xiao Xin. However, no matter how much he liked it, he liked his little wife more in the dead of night. Chapter 2387. Cher woke up and looked at him with her eyes wide open. Why are you here? At this moment, they had already arrived at his bedroom. Yimuyun pressed her against the soft mattress and kissed her while murmuring, I carried you here. Keep your voice down. With that said, he chuckled. Otherwise, that little one will cry again. Cher laid down softly. She was wearing a pure animal pajamas, and her black hair was scattered over her shoulders. It looked soft and soft, no different from when she was 18 years old. As he kissed her, the urgency in his heart eased a little. Instead, he wanted to talk to her. As he kissed her, his voice was husky and charming. If Yishu is not willing, then let her take the surname Lan. Cher's eyes widened, and she was a little shocked. Because she knew him, Yimuyun was a little domineering. To put it bluntly, he was domineering and possessive. How could he be willing to let Yishu take the surname Lanyu? She was still in shock and forgot to speak. He kissed her and said with a smile, Are you silly? You still don't believe me, huh? At last, he kissed a soft piece of flesh behind her ear and bit down hard. She moaned and opened her eyes, which were filled with tears, and looked at him pitifully. You're mine. That's enough. He finally got to the point, and his voice was even hoarser. Cher? She snorted softly and then hugged his neck, burying her little face in his neck to ease the overheated temperature. Her voice was also light, weak, and helpless. His thin lips covered her ear, and his hot breath blew against her ear. It was so hot that it made her tremble in fear. Don't leave me again. After that, it was endless possession. Cher felt that he seemed to be going crazy, and she could only keep hugging him. The last trace of sweat turned from hot to cold. She moved uncomfortably in his arms. I want to take a shower. Yimuyun grunted, propped up his arms, and carried her easily. Finally, in the bathroom, he played 2 more times. When he came out, he gently helped her put on her pajamas, carried her back to her bedroom, and placed her next to Xiao Yishu. He propped himself up with one arm and kissed her lightly. His voice was hoarse. I really don't want to let go of you. He kissed her little mouth again and again, full of longing. Cher couldn't help but turn her little face away and snorted, unrestrained. He chuckled, his fingers gently caressing her little face. He was reluctant to let go of that soft touch and said in a hoarse voice, I just want to, and I'm a little exhausted. If you want, Let's do it tomorrow night. HM? Who's with you tomorrow night? You're shameless. Cher turned her face away. Her small face was dyed with a touching expression. He smiled and pinched her little face. Then tomorrow morning, huh? After a pause, he smiled meaningfully. I can probably do it twice. Cher turned her little face back again. She glared at him and said incoherently, shameless, shameless, shameless. Where can I get a wife if I'm shameless? He chuckled, his hands carefully propped up on both sides of her body, and kissed her again and again. His voice was warm as he said, "Good night, Cher." She hummed, as though she was a baby. He looked at her deeply, and he couldn't help but lower his head and kiss her on the lips. After the kiss, he didn't leave, but lingered for a while more. Chapter 2388. He kissed her affectionately for a long time before saying in a low voice, "I'm going out now. This little one is really annoying." Even when Daddy and Mommy made love, they had to do it secretly. After that, they had to send her back. Yun turned his head and kissed his little girl as well. After that, his expression was very gentle. Before he left, he adjusted the lighting in the bedroom to the most comfortable lighting possible. Then, in the dim yellow light, he lowered his head and whispered in her ears, "Baby, are you happy now?" After asking that, he left and closed the door with a gentle smile. Cher laid in the dim yellow light while hugging Xiao Yishu. She felt really good. She felt really happy that he was like this now. Early in the morning, Xiao Yishu was the first to wake up. She raised her head and kissed her mummy affectionately. Just as she was about to hug her mummy to sleep for a while more, she noticed that there seemed to be some bruises on her mummy's neck. The television said that this was a hickey. The little one was stunned. Then, she realized that Yi Sanson had lied to her and kissed her mummy secretly again. Xiao Yishu turned around angrily and faced Cher with her little P***is. She did not make a single sound, as though she was an abandoned child. Cher was in a deep sleep and did not notice anything. As for the little one, he was fuming as his fat little body curled up together. After a long time, his mummy still did not come to coax him. Hence, he turned his head and hugged her before bursting into tears. Cher opened her eyes. She was really sleepy. The little one's cries were so loud that she had no choice but to get up in a flurry to coax him. Yimiyun came over as well. Perhaps he had just showered. He was only wrapped in a towel. Droplets of water dripped down from the ends of his hair, dripping down his body and onto the parts of his body that would make anyone want to vomit. Cher stared at him, unable to tear her eyes away. That plump little person was the same. He stared blankly with tears in his eyes. After watching for a long time, she suddenly burst into tears again. Wow, such a good-looking Yi Sanson. Mom will definitely like him. The little girl was crying so hard that she was out of breath. Yi Miyun went over and held her in his arms. Then he looked at Cher and asked, "What's wrong?" Cher looked confused and shook her head to show that she didn't know either. The little guy looked at them and started crying again. She had been crying for so long, but these adults actually didn't know what she was crying about. It was too hateful. Yi Miyun hugged his beloved daughter, feeling both angry and amused at the same time. Xiao Yishu's appearance greatly resembled Cher's when she was young. She was truly adorable. He reached out and patted the little guy. His voice was especially soft. "All right, baby, don't cry." The little guy looked up and pouted. "From now on, I'll sleep with you." Yi Miyun couldn't help but laugh, a deep smile appearing in his eyes. "All right." Then the little guy opened its adorable eyes wide and looked at him. Cher watched from the side and covered her head with the blanket. She secretly sighed in her heart. Was she as dumb and adorable as Ishu when she was young? Was that why she was fooled by him? Yi Miyun looked at the little guy lying down from the corner of his eyes and smiled. "Cher, I'm also very happy now. What should I do?" From that day onwards, Lon Error and Yi Sanson started to fight. At night, it was as if he was torturing an eagle. He opened his cute eyes and stared at Yi Miyun. "Yi Sanson, you're not allowed to sneak into Mummy's room after I fall asleep." Chapter 2389. Little Lon Error hugged him tightly. Yi Sanson's body was warm, and his skin was young and supple. She felt good hugging him. If Yi Sanson was willing to be Yi Sanson, she could still accept it. Little Lon Error thought to himself. As he thought about it, his little head moved like a chick pecking at grains, bit by bit. Yi Muyun's gaze was filled with warmth as he looked at his little girl. 10 minutes later, the little girl finally fell asleep. She lay sweetly in his arms. Perhaps she was afraid of the cold. Her little pink fingers curled up on his chest, as if to absorb the warmth. Yi Muyun's gaze was extremely gentle as he looked at his little girl quietly. He kissed her, but still felt that it was not enough. Originally, he had intended to look for the child's mother. But now that he was hugging his little girl, he suddenly did not feel like moving. He just wanted to hug the little girl like this, to feel her warmth. Actually, it did not matter if her surname was Qin or Yi. As long as she was his child, it was fine. Moreover, this child had said that she did not want him, but now she was so intimately nestled in his arms. How could he not like her? Yi Muyun's eyes were filled with tenderness. He hugged the little girl and closed his eyes, smelling her milky scent. Strangely, he fell into a deep sleep. At daybreak, the little boy woke up. She peeked and sniffed Yi Sanson's body. Other than her own scent, she did not smell anything else. She pursed her lips and hugged him tightly to sleep again. Yi Muyun opened his eyes. There was a trace of smile in his eyes. This little girl was still worried about him. His gaze was filled with the love of a father. Even though this child came unprepared and her gender was unclear, he still loved her. He loved her very much, just like how he loved Xiaoxin in the past. He carefully placed her in his arms and continued to sleep with a smile on his face for the next few days. The little boy dominated Yi Sanson's sleep. These few days, Yi Sanson behaved himself and did not sneak into his mother's room. Hence, the little girl was temporarily relieved and continued to dominate Yi Sanson. Cher did not know whether to laugh or cry, but she was happy because she could not stand Yi Muyun's excessive demands. His needs were as big as a beast's. That night, after taking a shower, she quietly returned to the bedroom and sat in front of the vanity mirror to dry her hair. The bedroom door opened softly and closed again. She looked at the person coming in through the mirror, turned off the hairdryer, and asked helplessly, "Is Ishu asleep?" Yi Muyun walked in quietly and walked behind her. He leaned over and smelled the fragrance of her hair. His voice was a little vague. "Yes, she's asleep. Then come back. She will wake up, or she will cry again," Cher said, and turned on the hairdryer again. He took the hairdryer from her hand and smiled faintly. "He's in a deep sleep. He won't wake up any time soon." He very naturally blow-dried her hair, his movements professional. Both of them were silent, and their eyes met in the mirror from time to time. She recalled everything, but the way they interacted now was different from the past. It felt like an old married couple. Cher's eyes were filled with tears. She took the skincare products on the table and gently wiped them on her face. Her gaze was on him in the mirror, and she asked in a low voice, "What do you want to do here?" Chapter 2390. He switched off the hairdryer and cupped a lock of her silky hair. He leaned over to sniff it and said in a low voice, "Tang Shuo, we haven't done it in 4 days. You've been going to the hospital every day for the past 4 days, huh? You were the one who agreed to sleep with Ishu." She was still sitting there, looking at each other in the mirror. He only had a bathrobe on, and his face was covered with love jade. He had no intention of hiding it. He nibbled on her neck and said, "Didn't you miss me?" As he spoke, he picked her up, swept away the skincare products with one hand, and carried her to the dressing table. The bottles fell on the floor. Cher covered her eyes and sighed. "It's very expensive." He stood in the middle of them and said with a chuckle, "I'll buy more for you." At this moment, he had no choice but to do it. She bit her lip and said, "Go to the bed." However, he chuckled and teased her. "Do it here once, and then I'll carry you there, huh?" Their clothes were very convenient. Omit 10,000 words. She bit his shoulder and said weakly, "Bastard." He chuckled. "I'm not a man if I don't do it." He was panting. "Am I a man if I don't use such a beautiful wife at home?" As he said that, he whipped her ruthlessly. Cher felt like she was better off dead. After one round, she felt like she was better off dead. However, The man who had been starving for 4 days wouldn't let her go so easily. In the bathroom and on the bed, he tortured her again. After that, he hugged her for a while and went back to his bedroom. Cher lay on the bed, gritting her teeth. This bastard. The next day, Xiao Yishu found that Yi Sanson was in a good mood. Later, she found that Yi Sanson was in a good mood every few days. However, the little fellow didn't have any evidence that Yi Sanson had sneaked out, so there was nothing she could do. However, Yi Sanson often sent her and her mother to the hospital to visit her father, so Xiao Yishu turned a blind eye. In her heart, Lan Yu was still the #1 father. As for Yi Sanson, he was #2. At Shenyuan Hospital, Yi Muyun sent Cher and Yishu to the ward. He didn't want to see his youngest daughter call Lan Yu daddy, so he went to the side to smoke. When he got out of the car to get the cigarettes, he happened to see Qin Mu and Zhou Chongwang getting out of the car. Qin Mu's face was a little pale. When she saw Yi Muyun, she was stunned. Then, she smiled faintly. "Brother, why are you in the hospital?" "Lan Yu has been awake for a few days. I sent Cher and the others over to take a look." Yi Muyun lit a cigarette and smoked quietly. Then, he looked at his sister and asked, "What's wrong with you? You don't look well." Qin Mu pursed her lips and said softly, "I don't have a good appetite, so I came over to have checkup." Yi Muyun nodded and looked at Zhou Chongwang. "Go with her. Let me know when you come out." Zhou Chongwang's expression was a little nervous. He didn't say much and just helped Qin Mu into the elevator. Yi Muyun looked at their backs with a deep gaze. He could tell that Zhou Chongwang was interested in Qin Mu. It was impossible for them to separate. Chapter 2391. He smoked his cigarette quietly and smiled faintly. In the elevator, Qin Mu and Zhou Chongwang stood side by side. She whispered, "I'm not pregnant." "I know. I'm just checking." Zhou Chongwang reached out and touched her little head. His voice was quite gentle. Recently, his relationship with Qin Mu was very stable. Although it was not like that of other couples, it was still considered close for an old couple who had been married for many years. When the elevator reached the 4th floor of the clinic, Qin Shun was already waiting there. He personally arranged the best gynecologist for Qin Mu. Qin Mu went in for the examination, while Qin Shun and Zhou Chongwang waited outside. All these years, Qin Shun had been abroad. Even Zhou Chongwang was not familiar with him. Even the outside world did not know that there was such a child in the Qin family. If the possibility of pregnancy is ruled out, she probably needs to go to the gastroenterology department. Qin Shin's voice was very faint. Zhou Chongwang's expression was a little complicated. He told Qin Shin the truth. "I hope that Mu is pregnant." Qin Shun was tall and thin, and his overly beautiful face looked a little lazy. Why? This doctor was too evil. Even Zhou Chongwang felt that he looked secular and rustic in front of him. Yes, this child of the Qin family who came back from America was actually several times younger than him. He was the same age as Qin Mu, and now he was only 22 years old. Apart from his young and good-looking appearance, he was full of ABCs. He was a very Western person. Although he did not speak English, he was a very Western person just by standing there. He was dangerous and charming. He was the kind of person that both men and women would like. Although he was the same age as Qin Mu, he was so experienced that he was 8 Wall Street ahead of Qin Mu. Zhou Chongwang found that he was actually looking for similarities between his face and Qin Mu's. When he realized this, he avoided his eyes in embarrassment. Damn it, he was really a strange person. Qin Shin looked at him with a lazy smile, as if he had seen through everything. At that moment, Zhou Chongwang was in a mess, and he secretly decided to keep Mu away from the twins in the future. How could there be such a big difference between the twins? How pure his Mu was. After waiting for a long time, the two of them did not say anything else. When Qin Mu came out, her expression said it all. She wasn't pregnant. It's okay. Zhou Chongwang comforted her gently. Qin Shun arranged other tests for the gastroenterology department, and there were no problems. Qin Shun went to talk with the gynecologist for a while, and then he came over and said lightly, "It's okay." He patted Qin Mu's shoulder. "Relax. Don't put too much pressure on yourself, all right?" Qin Mu. Qin Shin gave her a hug and said, "I'm here." He said a few more words to Zhou Chongwang and sent them away. Then he went back to the gynecology department to see the doctor. The female doctor left and closed the door. When she looked back at Qin Shun, she sighed softly. Qin Shun, who had always been a little cynical, also looked a little nervous. "Is the situation not good?" The female doctor nodded and said seriously, "Not very good." She pursed her lips and then continued, "Her uterus has a cold disease, so it's not easy for her to get pregnant." Qin Shun put his hand in his white coat. "Dr. Bai, can she recuperate?" Chapter 2392. Dr. Bai sighed softly. She didn't treat herself well when she was young, and that's why she got sick. Illness is like spinning silk. You need to be patient and don't give her any pressure. Mum, Qin Shin replied. "Dr. Bai, you know that our family doesn't lack Qin Mu to give birth to a child. As for Zhou Chongwang, if Qin Mu's only meaning to him was to give birth to a child, then this marriage was dispensable." Dr. Bai's relationship with the Qin family was not deep, but she knew Qin Shun. He looked carefree and didn't care about anything, but deep down, he was very concerned about Qin Mu. She sighed in her heart again. After all, they came out of the same womb. Their relationship was indeed different. Dr. Bai prescribed some warm and nourishing medicine. It was not harmful, and she didn't need to stop taking the medicine to get pregnant. Qin Shin took the medicine and smiled faintly. "Thank you." After that, he walked out. Dr. Bai looked at the tall and thin back view of him and shook her head gently. How could such a good-looking girl think of herself as a man? Qin Shin walked to the stairwell and leaned against the wall. He squinted his eyes and looked at the prescription. At this moment, someone stood beside him. He looked sideways and saw that it was Yi Muyun. "Brother." Qin Shin's voice was a little muffled. He threw the prescription in his hand to him and said calmly, "Qin Mu's illness." Yi Muyun took the prescription and looked at it carefully for a minute. He looked up. "Does she know about it?" "I don't know." Qin Shin leaned against the wall and tilted his head. "I don't want to tell her. Tell Zhou Chongwang and see what he says." Yi Muyun nodded in agreement and passed the prescription back to him. "It's a good idea. I'll leave it to you. You're the doctor, so you're the most suitable person to do this." Qin Shin narrowed his eyes. "Brother, don't you think it's more suitable for Qin Mu to live with you all these years? I don't get along well with Zhou Chongwang. Besides, you're a doctor. You're a professional." Yi Muyun's voice was calm, and he pushed it back. Qin Shin cursed, "Fuck. Not even grass." Yi Muyun said softly, "Also be more refined. Have you really considered yourself a man after all these years?" Qin Shin took the prescription and left as if he had seen a ghost. Yi Muyun smiled and rubbed the space between his eyebrows. He felt a headache coming on. Yes, both of his sisters had a headache. In the past, he thought that the twins were fake, but both of them were girls. He didn't know who thought that the little bump on Qin Shin's body when he was born was that thing. However, Mr. Yi immediately thought of the little yellow boy at home. He didn't seem to be any better. He was only 5 years old, but he didn't listen to others. Mr. Yi thought seriously that he should use Qin Shun as a negative example. If he asked Qin Shun to take off his male clothes in front of Xiao Yishu, Qin Shin probably wouldn't agree. Mr. Yi still felt a headache. On the other side, Qin Shun walked to a quiet place and sent a message to Zhou Chongwang, arranging to meet alone at 9 o'clock in the evening. He put away his phone and quietly looked at the list in his hand. Then he walked to the top floor of the inpatient department. He pushed open the door to Lan Yu's ward, and the atmosphere was really weird. Cher was curled up on the sofa playing games. Xiao Yishu was trying her best to tease Lan Yu, and Lan Yu still looked like he had nothing to live for. Qin Shin chuckled and walked over with his hands still in his pockets. Chapter 2393. He bent down to get close to Xiao Yishu's face and said with a smile, "Are you Yi Muyun's little bun?" Not to mention Xiao Yishu, even Cher didn't quite know who Qin Shin was. For a moment, she just stood there. Qin Shin smiled. "I'm Mr. Ye's younger brother." As he spoke, his fingers were still holding the little yellow bun. He even leaned over to smell it. But he turned his head and said to Cher, "My brother used to be obsessed with the smell of your body. It's really perverted, but you don't smell like you've been weaned." Cher blushed. After all, he was her brother-in-law. Was he flirting with her? Chin Chin smiled charmingly, but sister-in-law has grown up. She's quite beautiful, and I like her very much. Before he finished speaking, Lan Yu, who was lying on the sickbed, threw a book at him. "Get out." Lan Yu hated this black-hearted doctor. He felt that if there was no doctor named Chin Chin in this world, the air would be much fresher. Chin Chin dodged it easily, with one hand still in his pocket, and said with a faint smile, "I dare to express it. Unlike some people who clearly like you, after 5 years, they make themselves like a eunuch." Lan Yu's dark face turned green. Originally, when Xiao Yishu and Cher came over, although he didn't want to, he was secretly happy in his heart. But, however, this little bit of happiness was completely destroyed by this black-hearted doctor. At this moment, Lan Yu wanted to chop Chin Chin to pieces. This black-hearted doctor not only insulted his physique, but also his character. "Eunuch?" When Lan Yu wanted to refute, Cher said in a low voice, "He's not." There was silence. At this moment, Cher bit her lips and said, "He has another woman." Chin Chin almost laughed, and Lan Yu almost fainted. He might as well not explain to her. Chin Chin's fingers gently let go of Xiao Yishu, and the little yellow bun fell on the sickbed, right on Lan Yu's injured leg. It was quite miserable. Then, Chin Chin, quack Dr. Chin, leaned over and stuck his pretty face on Lan Yu's face. He smiled wickedly. "So Mr. Lan is secretly eating." Lan Yu was furious and stared at him. Chin Chin smiled happily and picked up the little yellow bun again. He said lightly, "Well, it's visiting time. Sister-in-law, take Ishu downstairs. Big brother is still waiting for you." Every word he said stabbed Lan Yu's heart, and Lan Yu lay down directly. And Chin Chin threw the little guy into Cher's arms and blinked. "Mr. Lan's treatment time is up. For the sake of Mr. Lan's dignity, don't watch the treatment process." How pitiful. Cher looked at Lan Yu on the sickbed sympathetically. She had an illusion that Lan Yu seemed to bury his head again. Would he to be tortured by Chin Chin until he became insane? She thought. Chin Chin smiled. "Don't worry, sister-in-law. I'm good at it." Cher looked solemn and looked at Lan Yu sympathetically. Xiao Yishu looked innocent. "Dad, you have to cooperate with the doctor for the injection." Lan Yu smiled reluctantly. "Son, you don't know how thick this black-hearted doctor's needles are. They're the kind used for pigs." "Forget it, son. Anyway, you have never seen a pig." Chapter 2394. Chin Chin sat beside him and smiled. "One of your legs is crippled, but you're still so obsessed with one thing." Lan Yu's face turned dark red and became the color of pig liver. Thinking of how down and out the world-class painter Lan Yu was now, it was really lamentable. "What do you want, black-hearted doctor?" Chin Chin smiled meaningfully. "I forgot that you don't look at yourself in the mirror. If you look at yourself in the mirror, you'll know that I won't have any bad thoughts about you." Lan Yu was already lucky that he didn't pass out. After Chin Chin finished speaking, he looked at Lan Yu quietly with a deep gaze. Lan Yu felt goosebumps. He felt that Chin Chin's gaze could penetrate his soul. Chin Chin smiled. "All right, I won't be giving you an injection today. I'll give you a massage." Lan Yu looked at him suspiciously. Would he be so kind as to let go of the opportunity to torture him? In Lan Yu's heart, he had already given up the hope of leaving the hospital. He was just waiting, living one day at a time. He wanted to see how many methods this beautiful, sissy, black-hearted doctor had to torture and humiliate him. Chin Chin looked at him and smiled. "There's no need for a nurse today. I'll do it myself." Lan Yu pursed his lips and gritted his teeth. "What do you want now?" "Treatment. I want to see if that part of yours is still working." Chin Chin smiled wickedly. The muscles on Lan Yu's thin face kept twitching. He really couldn't accept being examined by a man. However, Chin Chin's hands were very fast and steady, as if he had done this thousands of times. He took off the hospital gown swiftly and said calmly, "I've minored in andrology." Her gaze shifted upwards and landed on Lan Yu's face. Then, she said something that would make Lan Yu feel ashamed for the rest of his life. It's been so long since you woke up, but you haven't gotten up, have you? The veins on Lan Yu's forehead bulged as he forced out a few words. Get out of here. Calm down. Qin Shan pressed his shoulder down easily. Being irritable isn't good for your recovery. Lan Yu breathed heavily and said unhappily, but you've always been making me angry. Arouse your survival instincts. But you have to restrain yourself. Qin Shan raised an eyebrow, then put on a mask and gloves. Lan Yu gritted his teeth. Am I that dirty? In my eyes, this is just a lesion. Qin Shan's voice was very calm. At this time, his eyes were sharp and professional. He did not look like a black-hearted doctor at all. Then, Lan Yu closed his eyes and endured the examination of the handsome male doctor. This process was simply torture for him. Qin Shan's movements were very professional. He did not avoid his gaze and even tried to use professional methods to test. Of course, Lan Yu still couldn't do it. After about 10 minutes of examination, Qin Shan ended the examination. His tone was very calm. Probably not for the time being. The root of the disease is not here. It's still this leg. Lan Yu just looked at her, unable to tell whether he was sad or happy. Qin Shan paused for a moment before slowly taking off his gloves. He said calmly, in other words, if the nerve in your leg is really necrotic, then you'll be a eunuch. Lan Yu was originally very calm, but after hearing this, anyone would be furious. Is this how you comfort a patient? Chapter 2395. Qin Shan laughed happily and threw the glove on his face. Take a good whiff of your own scent. After saying that, he put his hands in his pockets and walked out leisurely. The door closed and an angry voice came from inside. Quack! Qin Shan smiled, pushed the hair on his forehead, and walked toward the elevator. The young nurses passing by looked at him eagerly. God, Dr. Qin is so handsome. Dr. Qin was the #1 male god of Xinyuan Hospital. Every move he made was extremely handsome, just like the Lysian in the game that made him fall in love with the game producer. His eyes were simply electrifying. When he was in love, it was simply unimaginable how charming he was. When he called baby, they would probably fly to heaven. Qin Shan walked into the elevator under the adoring eyes of a group of young nurses. He had long been accustomed to the adoration and worship of women. When he turned around in the elevator, the young nurses inexplicably felt that he looked like Bai Qi. Oh my God, so handsome. In the ward, Lan Yu once again felt hopeless. After work, Qin Shan took out the piece of paper from his white coat and looked at it for a long time. Although he had an appointment with Zhou Chengwang at 9 o'clock, he arrived at the night bar before 8 o'clock. He ordered a glass of white martell, listened to the music, and casually smoked. He did not smoke much, about 2 or 3 cigarettes in an hour. Qin Shan had a mixture of bad and arrogant aura, which was very attractive to young girls, especially today when he took off his thin coat and wore a black shirt with 2 buttons unbuttoned, revealing his delicate collarbone. Delicate was the impression that Qin Shan gave people, but not feminine. His beauty was particularly natural. He was a man who was insanely good-looking. Of course, there were many women who came over because Qin Shan was wearing the world's top brands and his temperament showed that he came from a good family. He looked like a diamond man. However, he was very cold, and those women returned empty-handed. When Zhou Chengwang came over, he saw a woman leaving angrily. He couldn't help but smile. He walked over, took off his coat, and sat opposite Qin Shan. What's wrong? Aren't you interested in that woman? He only knew that Qin Shan had been studying medicine in the United States and was a genius doctor. But didn't they say that the more talented a doctor was, the more pressure he would feel? Qin Shan glanced at him and didn't say anything. He just raised his hand to beckon the waiter. Give this gentleman a glass of whiskey. Zhou Chengwang originally wanted to refuse, but it was rare for his brother-in-law to ask him out. Although this brother-in-law didn't seem to be a good person, he was much easier to deal with than Yi Muyun. As Zhou Chengwang thought of this, he didn't say anything. After a while, the waiter brought the wine over. He took a sip and looked up. What's the matter? Qin Shan took out another cigarette, put it on his lips, and tilted his head. Haven't you already guessed it? Zhou Chongguang smiled bitterly. It's Qin Mu, isn't it? Qin Shen only cared about smoking. After about half a cigarette, he took out a piece of paper. This was prescribed by today's doctor. Qin Mu's uterus is cold, and it's difficult for her to get pregnant. She needs to take care of it slowly. When Zhou Chongguang was stunned, he slowly said, also, Qin Mu's psychological pressure is too great. His eyes were burning. If there's a next time, Zhou Chongguang, don't ever think about seeing her again. Chapter 2396. Actually, he and Qin Mu had been together for a long time without using contraception, so he knew that there must be something wrong. However, he didn't expect that the youngest member of the Qin family was no easier to deal with than Yi Muyun. She was so sharp. He was silent for a long time before saying in a low voice, "What I care about the most isn't the child." "I hope so." Qin Chen's voice was indifferent. He then put out his cigarette and stood up. "Let's go." Zhou Chongguang stopped him, looking hesitant. "Oh yes, I have a cousin who studies music. She's about the same age as you. Do you want to introduce her to me?" He was admitting that he was trying to rope him in. Qin Shen put on his coat and frowned slightly. He then turned to look at Zhou Chongguang. "I have no intention of getting a girlfriend." Zhou Chongguang was a little stunned. Could it be that Qin Shen was AG? When he returned to the villa, he couldn't tell Qin Mu what was on his mind. Instead, he talked about Qin Shen. Zhou Chongguang asked Qin Mu tentatively, asking her if Qin Shen's sexual orientation was normal. Qin Mu lay on the bed and laughed for a long time. She laughed so hard that she was about to cry. Zhou Chongguang propped himself on both sides of her body and pinched her chin with one hand. He said in a deep voice, "How dare you laugh at me, huh?" Qin Mu hooked her arms around his neck. "Why don't you guess? Why doesn't he get a girlfriend?" Zhou Chongguang looked at her suspiciously. "I can't think of any other reason other than AG." Qin Mu leaned close to his ear and said softly, "Because he's a girl. How do you expect him to get a girlfriend?" Zhou Chongguang's expression looked like he had eaten something. He narrowed his eyes. "Really? How could this be possible?" Although Qin Shen was excessively beautiful, her manly aura, slightly evil appearance, and clothes made her look like a man. It didn't seem out of place at all. Moreover, he and Mu Mu were born together. Qin Mu. Suddenly, Zhou Chongguang felt as if he was struck by lightning. He forgot that Qin Mu also had 172. It wasn't unusual for Qin Shen to be around 175 centimeters tall, and they were both tall and thin. If they had been raised as boys, it would indeed be hard to tell them apart. Zhou Chongguang rolled to the side and covered his eyes with the back of his hand. He sighed. How did she do it? Really, he couldn't tell at all. Qin Mu laid on his chest and replied softly, "Yes. For many years, she has always been like this, and since she was young, many girls have liked her." Zhou Chongguang secretly cursed her as a pervert in his heart. Then he turned his head to look at his little wife and asked very seriously, "Does he go to the men's bathroom or the women's bathroom?" Qin Mu pinched his arm. "You have to ask Qin Shen." "I wouldn't dare." Zhou Chongguang sighed. He's not to be trifled with. He still thought that Qin Shen was a man. Yes, he would treat him as a brother. It was better not to know. After asking about Qin Shen, he thought of the prescription that Qin Shen had given him. It was all Chinese medicine. He had already secretly grabbed the medicine, and the rest was to find a way to trick Mu Mu into drinking it. Zhou Chongguang propped up half of his body and looked at Qin Mu seriously. "I plan to take a month off during the new year. We don't want children for the time being. I want to take you out for a walk." Qin Mu looked at him in shock. He was a little surprised, and then he said slowly, "Didn't you want a child before?" Chapter 2397. He kissed her and said passionately, "I suddenly realized that I haven't had enough fun yet. Mu Mu, let's play for another 2 years, okay?" Qin Mu was kissed by him and couldn't break free. She could only hit his shoulder with her little hand and said intermittently, "The wind is the rain." After kissing for a while, he moved his thin lips to her ear and said hoarsely, "After thinking about it, my wife is still the most fun." Qin Mu turned her face away and bit his chin. "Bad guy." Zhou Chengwang's gaze was deep. He propped himself up and looked at her deeply. His voice was also hoarse. Do you like bad guys? Qin Mu looked disgusted. You smell of alcohol. Get lost. He chuckled softly and easily folded her in his arms, kissing her forcefully. When it came to sex, even 10 Qin Mus were no match for him. Soon, she softened into a pool of water and was at his mercy. Vaguely, she felt that he had taken the tea. Qin Mu held his hand and frowned. If we have it, we won't go out. It's the same in B City. Mrs. Zhou, I've changed my mind. I want to play for another 2 years. He leaned close to her ear and said passionately. At the same time, he sealed her little mouth so that she wouldn't have a chance to speak again. After a few times, they were finally exhausted. After lying together for a while, Zhou Chengwang carefully carried her to the bathroom and treated her as if he was serving a princess. Recently, he was quite infatuated with his wife and couldn't bear to let go of her. Sometimes, Qin Mu would find him annoying and felt that a layer of her skin was about to fall off. She patted his hand and said weakly, Zhou Chengwang, that's enough. Don't come again. She was really afraid of him. He was a 28-year-old man, and his physical strength was abnormally good. He could stay up for a night, but she didn't have such good physical strength to accompany him. Sometimes, when Qin Mu was angry, she would kick him and ask him to go outside to find a woman to solve his problem. But every time she said that, he would probably peel off a layer of her skin that night. Later on, when Zhou Chengwang was torturing her, he would tease her. As he tormented her, he would murmur, Baby, you said that because you want me to torture you like this, right? At that moment, Qin Mu even had the thought of killing him. After a long time, she really understood that although Zhou Chengwang looked gentle, he was actually a carnivore. It must have been hard for him to come home every night. She thought about it. At that time, he could be considered to have restrained himself. She didn't know if it was because he wasn't interested in her body or because he was having too much fun in the company. As if sensing her thoughts, Zhou Chengwang pinched her little face and said unhappily, Do you think I have such a good appetite for just anyone? Qin Mu was still lying in the bathtub. Looking at his handsome appearance, she suddenly said faintly, Zhou Chengwang, how can sex go on without love? What about you? His fingers rubbed her little face gently, and he said faintly, Then what did you think when I hugged you? Endure. Qin Mu looked up and said bluntly. In the end, Zhou Chengwang reached out and pinched her little face. You really dare to say it. Since Mr. Zhou dares to do it, why wouldn't I dare to say it? Qin Mu retorted. He laughed softly. It's my fault. Chapter 2398. Qin Mu hugged him softly. Zhou Chengwang, what else can you do besides threatening me? A lot. He said maliciously, Don't worry, Mrs. Zhou. I'll make it come true for you in the future. Qin Mu bit his neck and then ignored him. When she couldn't see him, his eyes were deep but gentle. He put her under the quilt and carefully hugged her sleep. As long as he thought of Qin Shen's words, he didn't dare to let her feel any coldness. They lay under the quilt together, and he put her feet in his arms to keep her warm. Qin Mu couldn't fall asleep. She opened her eyes and said, I'm hot. Oh, he said softly, and then loosened his grip a little. In his arms, Qin Mu opened one of her eyes and looked at him. Zhou Chengwang, did you do something to let me down, huh? He couldn't help laughing. Of course not. Qin Mu snorted. You're unaccountably solicitous, so you must have ulterior motives. He couldn't help laughing and pinched her little face. Even if it's an adulterous eye, it's between us. It's not someone else's business. Qin Mu closed her eyes and said in a low voice, Don't hug me too tightly, or I won't be able to sleep. Zhou Chengwang looked at her calm little face and sighed in his heart. Mu, but I want to hug you. She was so tired that she fell asleep, but Zhou Chengwang didn't feel sleepy at all. Later, when she fell asleep, he quietly got out of bed and went outside to smoke 2 cigarettes. He was a little annoyed. Since Qin Shen had come to him so cautiously without letting Qin Mu know, the problem must be serious. His heart was heavy as he stood alone in the dark night. He even regretted asking her to have a child. If he had known earlier, He would have told her that he didn't like children. He only liked the two of them. A child was very annoying. However, there was no use in regretting. Now that their relationship was good, Qin Mu was also looking forward to the birth of a child. She liked to let her imagination run wild, and he did not dare to take any risks. Zhou Chengwang smoked 2 cigarettes outside and went back to the bedroom to lie beside her. Qin Mu probably felt cold on his body, so she avoided him and didn't want to be in his arms. He quietly lay down on the side, waiting for his body to warm up before pulling her into his embrace. Qin Mu lay obediently in his arms. She was very obedient, which was the best he had ever seen. Zhou Chengwang leaned over and pressed his warm, thin lips against her forehead. He said in a very low voice, "Mumu, we will go on together." She had fallen asleep, but she must have found him annoying. Her little hand slapped his handsome face. Zhou Chengwang couldn't help laughing, feeling a little helpless. He kissed her again unwillingly, but his heart was as gentle as water. A child was not so important to him. It might be more important to his mother, but he would persuade her. If it didn't work, he would adopt one. If the Zhou family had to have an heir. That night, Zhou Chengwang couldn't sleep at all. At this moment, he realized that if he loved a woman, he had to be completely devoted to her. Anything that came to him, he had to think about her and make her happy. If she was even a little unhappy, he would not be able to stand it. It turned out that love and affection were like this. Chapter 2399. She stretched out her little hand and played with it. It was a little prickly, but it was also a little fun, so she moved her little hand around. At first, Zhou Chengwang also played along with her. Later on, he was probably provoked and lowered his voice. "Stop it. If you keep playing, I'll fuck you." Qin Mu raised her little face and looked at him eagerly. After a while, she retracted her little hand and said, "Do you still have strength?" Zhou Chengwang held her little body in his arms and lowered his voice. "Do you want to try, Mrs. Zhou?" Qin Mu leaned on his shoulder and giggled. "Mr. Zhou, it's you who want to try." "Yes, I want to try. I want to do it," he said bluntly. She blushed and struggled, but he didn't let her and locked her in his arms. "Huh?" Qin Mu didn't struggle anymore. She simply lay in his arms and said softly, "Don't you need to go to work?" He said in a low voice, "I'm off today. I'll accompany you." Qin Mu bit her lip. "I don't dare to let you accompany me. How about sleeping instead?" He laughed softly, looking like he was up to no good. His little wife gently struggled against him. He smiled happily and pressed her shoulders. "All right, don't make a fuss. Be a good girl and sleep a little longer. I'll make breakfast for you." "That's great." Qin Mu lay down again and covered herself with the quilt, leaving only her eyes open. There was a smile in her eyes. That smile was full of happiness. Zhou Chengwang looked at her and felt touched. If he could, he would let her be happy like this forever. He reached out and rubbed her hair. His voice was a little hoarse. "All right, be good. Sleep well. There are bruises around your eyes." Qin Mu pulled the quilt to cover her little face and said in a muffled voice, "Mr. Zhou, you're the one with dark circles around your eyes. I can tell that you've been overindulging." He was so amused that he couldn't wait to pull her out of the quilt and do it again. But he just smiled, reached out, and pinched her little face, then got out of bed to wash his face. As Qin Mu lay down, she could hear the sound of him brushing his teeth in the bathroom, as well as the soft sound of him shaving. He shaved almost every day, and he didn't seem to like having a trace of discomfort on his face. Qin Mu sighed. In fact, he was quite a neat freak. When Zhou Chengwang came out of the changing room, he had already changed his clothes. He was wearing a light gray sweater and dark brown casual pants, looking very comfortable at home. When he passed by the bed, he purposely walked over to push aside her blanket and kissed her little face. Qin Mu covered her face and laughed. He also smiled slightly. "You're getting better at acting coquettishly." Actually, he was quite good. He also liked to spoil her. Zhou Chengwang casually went downstairs and entered the kitchen. The servants were a little surprised. "Let me make Madam's breakfast. You can leave first," he said in a low voice. Then he took out the Chinese medicine that he had prepared last night from the cabinet. He had never done this before, so he asked the servants to help him boil the medicine. "Sir, are you not feeling well?" The servant hesitated and asked, "This medicine is very choking." Well, Mumu caught a cold. There was a hint of gentleness on Zhou Chongwang's face. "It's for strengthening the body." The servant nodded and was very happy. Mr. Zhou was really good to the young lady now. How many men were willing to boil medicine for their wife early in the morning? Chapter 2400. He raised his hand to check the time. It was already past 9 o'clock, so he took the tray and went upstairs. The second floor was quiet. He pushed open the door of the master bedroom. Qin Mu seemed to be asleep and didn't move. He walked over, put the tray aside, sat by the bed and called her name. "Mu, wake up." Qin Mu turned over and said in a muffled voice, "Zhou Chongwang, I want to sleep for a while more. It's time for breakfast." He leaned over and whispered in her ear, "If you don't get up, I'll have sex." Qin Mu nodded and turned over again. She opened her eyes and glared at him. "Bossy." He took the opportunity to kiss her lips and said, "I got up early in the morning to make breakfast for you, and you said I was bossy, huh?" Qin Mu covered his lips. "I haven't brushed my teeth yet." He also reached out to grab her little hand and said meaningfully, "Qin Mu, you haven't washed your hands." She blushed, snorted, and glared at him. Finally, she sat up and watched him move the tray closer. "I haven't washed my hands." She wanted to get out of bed. Zhou Chongwang held her down and said, "Let me feed you." Qin Mu stuck out her tongue. "That's so mushy." However, she was lazy, so she leaned against the bed and let him feed her. They had never been so close before. He had never doted on her like this, and she had never had the face to ask for it before. Only now did she know that Zhou Chongwang could also dote on women. She felt a little complicated, but she still accepted it. She had said that she would give him a chance. After feeding her breakfast, he asked her solemnly, "How does it taste?" "It's okay. There's still room for improvement," she said euphemistically. Zhou Chongwang pinched her little face and smiled. He took the thermos beside him and said, "I found a doctor and gave you a prescription. It's to strengthen your body. You always catch colds. Try drinking medicine for 2 to 3 months and see if your body will get better." With that, he opened the bottle and poured himself a glass. Cher immediately felt repulsed by the strong smell of medicine. She pinched her nose and said in a humming voice, "Are you trying to poison me by making breakfast for me?" Zhou Chongwang didn't know whether to laugh or cry. However, he really didn't expect that Qin Mu would be so afraid of taking medicine. She had always been indifferent, unlike Tang Cher, who was clingy. But now, it seemed that all girls were the same. He didn't find it annoying. Instead, he liked it. Zhou Chongwang pulled away her little hand and chuckled. "How can I bear to poison you? If I poison you, where can I find another wife? Where can I find such a lovely girl?" Not only did he say that, he even kissed her hand. Qin Mu was a little stunned. She looked at him and said, "Zhou Chongwang, you're the one who said that I haven't washed my hands. I don't despise you." His voice was low and hoarse as he whispered in her ear, "When are you going to serve me as well?" In the past, they didn't have any tricks. But ever since they got back together, in order to please her, Zhou Chongwang felt that he had put in quite a bit of effort. He wasn't afraid of getting dirty or tired. However, Qin Mu was rather conservative and didn't really want to accept that kind of service. And as a man, he naturally wanted to. But he remembered that she had said that he was dirty, and he didn't dare to force her. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.